Welcome to another lesson of music history. Today we're going to be looking at the next era from what we last looked at, which was the Baroque era. Now the Baroque era we said lasted for 150 years, from the year 1600 to the year 1750. So what came after the Baroque era from the year 1750? The Classical era. And that lasted another 120, 125 years. The endings are always a blur. Where it started, where it finished, it's never like, all right, we finished the Baroque era here, we start the Classical. No, it's more like a slight blend into it. So the Classical era began in the year 1750 and ended right about 1820, as it was having a bit of a shift towards the Romantic era, right where Beethoven is. So Beethoven is actually known as the link, the connection between the Classical era and the Romantic era, all right? So right there where it was ending, Beethoven was writing music that was shifting in style from classical towards romantic. Just like every era, we need to understand the philosophy of the era. The Baroque era was full of flamboyance, full of decadence. Everything was well decorated. It wasn't just overly decorated, it was over and top blown off. They wanted to make everything super bedazzled. It was super decadent. So we had some of the most impressive virtuosic players of all time. A virtuoso is pretty much the extent of what you can get at. And when you're a virtuoso, there's literally no limit. So it's like, if you're extremely good, you are a virtuoso. And that means it is very unlikely that the common man is going to reach that level because you spend a lot of time in your craft. Anyway, aside from that, so the Baroque era was full of more, and they believed that more was more. All right, having over the top things is what made it what it was. When the Classical era came along, they wanted to temper it a little bit. They wanted to simplify what was over and top in the Baroque era, make it a little bit easier to understand. They wanted to take away some of that polyphony and replace it with something a little more friendly to the listener's ear, homophony. So that is when someone is playing chords and another person is playing melody. Whereas the Baroque era had a lot of polyphony, where it was just notes on top of notes. So if we look at Minuet in G by Bach, there was a lot of polyphony, two different melody lines working with each other. And when we look at a Classical era piece, it's very much what we do in ukulele. One person holding the chords, the other person playing the melody. Very easy to the listening ear, doesn't muffle up emotions, and it's very easy to follow along to. It's very understandable. That's what our modern ears are very much accustomed to. So the philosophy that really governed the Classical era was the universe was structured, organized, and beautiful in its simplicity. All right, so that's the main thing. They really wanted to focus on simplifying things. Notice how on each era, there's a simplification, a further simplification, just making it simpler and simpler, and it becomes better and better, ironically. The Baroque era believed they made it simpler, but the Classical era was like, no, we need it simpler from what you did in the Baroque era, you Baroqueans. We are not here to Baroque, we are classic people. Right, so a simplification and a belief that the universe was structured, organized, and beautiful in its simplicity. And as a result of that philosophy, they were moving away from the highly decorated Baroque era into something more simple and natural. Those are really the characteristics that govern the music in the Classical era. Simplicity and natural soundingness, okay? Now, a bit of history in the Classical era. Our main percussion instrument, and also the main instrument that was in a lot of Baroque era pieces, was the harpsichord. But the harpsichord gave birth to the next instrument that was made by Bartolomeo Cristofori, which was the piano. And now in the Classical era, the piano had finally taken form, and it was now being utilized by musicians, and they were incorporating it into their music. And what were some of the characteristics of the piano that made it a little bit more desirable than the harpsichord? Firstly, it had more dynamics. And so dynamics refer to how loud or how soft a note could be. If a note was just the same volume, bam, you hit it super hard, bam, hit it super soft, bam, that is not dynamic. That is a lack of dynamicism because it's just the same volume. So usually when you buy a baby, one of these toy keyboards, when you press it, it's as hard as possible, it's still the same amount of volume. When you press it softly, it's still the same amount of volume. But the real pianos and also more advanced keyboards, you press it softly, you get a doo. You press it a little bit louder, you get doo. You press it even louder, you get doo. And that's dynamics, okay? Referring to how loud or soft a note could be. And with dynamics, you can create emotion because you can create tenderness, you can create vigor, you can create intensity just by utilizing volume. So that was a major development in this piano, all right? The fact that you could have loud and soft notes all the time. And that in turn affected how your piece could be emotional. A couple other things that were going on in the classical era was we had our American Revolution from 1775 to 1783. We also had our French Revolution from 1789 to 1794. We had one of the most significant discoveries of all time, and that was electricity that Benjamin Franklin discovered in 1751. The first steamship that crossed the Atlantic in 1819, just before the end of the classical era. The first sewing machine was invented, and that allows all of us to have all our clothes. Obviously now they're using way more advanced machinery, but the sewing machine was the beginning of all these different machines that came forward. And we had our first vaccine, the smallpox vaccine, that was invented in the 1700s. I believe it started becoming commercialized in 1797. I'm not too sure. Check me up on that. Tell me if I'm wrong. So a couple of characteristics of the classical era. Firstly, its musical texture. It was no longer polyphonic. That was in the Baroque era. It was now homophonic, which is where you have a melody on top of a chordal accompaniment, which is what we do in all our ukulele pieces. Secondly, we had a lot of clarity in the pieces played. When you have one main melody being the dominant melody and it's not competing with other notes that are moving exactly like it, and that technique was called counterpoint. When you rid the music of counterpoint, you end up with a lot of simplicity and you can hear that melody more clearly and more distinctly. So a lot of clarity was one of the main characteristics that coined the classical era music. When it came to the nature of the melodies themselves, they were light and not complicated. They could hold a dun da da dun da da dun da 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 dun da 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 dun 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 da 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 instead of dun da da dun da da. That's when you have so much going on, it's overly decorated and it becomes a little bit complicated. But the classical era was simple. Dun da 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 dun. People could sing along. They could be able to memorize the melody. People didn't even need to memorize the melody. It would just naturally stick. Why? Because it was simple. And the human mind loves simplicity. It easily absorbs things that are simpler. So when you're making notes in your book, don't write every single thing the teacher is saying. Take the main stuff. That's the simple stuff, and that's the stuff you're really going to remember, okay? When it came to mood, classical era pieces differed from the Baroque in the sense that the Baroque era mainly focused on having one dominant mood throughout the whole piece. If it was a sad sounding piece, that was the mood all the way through, sadness. If it was a happy sounding piece, that was the mood all the way through. But the classical era said, all right, we're going to start off a little bit somber, but then we're going to build up in excitement. We're going to make it more joyous into the midsection. All right, then we can take it back down and make it a little bit more melancholic. So you would find numerous moods. Just because it started joyfully or it started somberly did not mean that that was going to be the mood throughout the whole piece. So the classical era had moods that were changing throughout the piece. Very important. Whereas the Baroque era, happy, whoop, all the way through, sad, all the way through. And obviously, there will be some Baroque era pieces where that was not happening, specifically towards the end when the classical era was being ushered in. Because remember, it's a bit of a blur. But that was one of the main characteristics that distinguished Baroque era music and classical era music. Another major characteristic that really defined the classical era was the prevalence of the piano. If you hear a piece that has a harpsichord in it, you can be 99.9% sure that it is not from the classical era. Why? Because when you have something that's better, why do you go back to the old machinery? Let's use our piano, let's not use our harpsichord anymore. So Baroque era music had a lot of harpsichord, and that was that buzzy sound, bzz, 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 whereas the piano, a lot more clear. So that was very popular in the classical era. So if you ever want to distinguish between the two, just try and listen. Can I hear a piano or can I hear a harpsichord? If I can hear a piano, most probably the classical era, because the piano wasn't fully developed in the Baroque era. All right. Another very important characteristic of the classical era was the prevalence of instrumental music. In the Baroque era, opera was invented and it took rise. People loved listening to opera, specifically the high in society. But in the classical era, now we had more instrumental music. We had sonatas, we had symphonies, we had concertos, we had string quartets. So there was a shift in musical taste where we wanted to hear more instrumental music. And even in its simplicity, it was still beautiful. But that did not mean that the classical era rid itself of opera. In fact, opera was still there, but it was mainly a different style of opera that really came about, known as opera buffa, which is comedic opera. And that was popularized by one of the composers we're going to look at, and also by Mozart. All right, very comedic plays, but with music governing the whole play. One final characteristic of the classical era was the development of all these concert houses, specifically public concert houses. Because remember, in the Baroque era, if you were a musician or a composer, you were mainly sponsored by the church, or you had a patron, or just someone very wealthy. A patron is someone very wealthy. So you'd be playing for the kings, you'd be playing for the princes. But when the classical era came about, we still had those patrons. You'd still find popular composers and popular musicians being supported by these patrons, either by a baron, by a prince, by a duke, by a king, by some people in the church. However, there was a shift. That was not the only realm where you could earn your income. Now with public concert houses, musicians and composers started earning a significant amount of their income because they could sell tickets to the public. So once again, the general public gained even more access than they had in the Baroque era. Even though they still had some bit of access, more than they had in the Renaissance, they now had more than they had in the Baroque. So with each era, there was more of an opening towards the public. And in the classical era, selling of tickets in public concert houses gave musicians a significant way, a very important way for them to be able to support themselves, no longer having to rely on rich people, but being able to rely on the popularity of their music and how much people wanted to listen to them. When it came to instruments in the classical era, we had within the string family, we had the violin, the viola, the cello, the double bass. We had that full string quartet. But the string quartets didn't just mean you have to have one of each. You could have just 4 violins and that would work. You could have 3 violins, 1 viola. You could have 1 double bass, 1 cello, 2 violins. The point is it was a quartet. All right. And then you had the harp. When it comes to our woodwind instruments, we have the full selection of woodwind instruments. We have our flute, we have our clarinet, we have our oboe, and we have our bassoon, and also that tiny little looking like recorder thing, mini oboe, whatever you want to look at it. We had our piccolo. So we literally had the full array of woodwind instruments in the classical era. When it came to brass, now we had our trumpet, we had our trombone, and we had our French horn. Notice how we don't have a saxophone yet. That came far later on, towards the beginning of the 20th century. When it came to our percussion instruments, we had our major instrument, which was the piano, and we also had the timpani, which was also there in the Baroque era. And a couple of key composers within the classical era. Obviously, we know Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. If you ever get a chance, go visit his house in Austria. It's very interesting. The chocolates are interesting as well. I didn't really like them, but maybe you like them. We also had Joseph Haydn. We also have Franz Schubert. And lastly, the person who connected the two eras from the classical to the romantic, Ludwig van Beethoven. All right, and that is our overview for the classical era. Go ahead and check out our first composer for this era and see how their lives were shaped, how they developed their different styles of music within this era, and have fun understanding and listening to what this composer brought forward towards this era. See you next time.